Good morning and welcome back to our virtual conference, GMSH 2021, Queer Sex After HIV. We're happy to have you here today on this, the final day of 4 weeks of incredible content, informative content by our Alliance members and by leaders in our sector. When we have our heads down and we're doing our HIV and sexual health work locally in communities across the province, we can often forget sometimes where the HIV movement was born from. The GMSH, as a provincial serving regional network, remains unique in Canada, and international networks of gay and bisexual men in the HIV response are even less common. Our closing keynote speaker today leads one such network to advance the health and human rights of gay and bisexual men in countries around the world, where having gay sex is often criminalized, and where local activists and responders are living their lives working to address HIV under multiple threats to their safety and to their security, and where stigma and discrimination abounds in healthcare settings. What I think makes today's closing extra special is that MPact, formerly known as the Global Forum on MSM and HIV, got its start at the International AIDS Conference in 2006 here in Toronto. It was developed and initiated by activists who were concerned about the disproportionate burden of HIV shouldered by gay and bisexual men, which we know continues today, both here in Canada and globally. So, Dr. Andrew Spieldenner, or Andy as I can refer to him, in addition to being the Executive Director of MPact, he is an Associate Professor of Health Communication at California State University and a visiting scholar at Concordia University, not too far from us in Montreal. Andy is a community-engaged researcher and advocate with 25 years of experience in HIV. He's held positions at the New York State Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, the Black AIDS Institute, the National Association of People with AIDS, and the Latino Commission on AIDS. Openly living with HIV, Andy is currently the North American delegate to UNAIDS, the UN Joint Program on HIV. In this role, he negotiates with member states and advocates for a human rights approach to end the HIV epidemic. He's the vice chair of the United States People Living with HIV Caucus. This caucus puts on AIDS Watch, which is an annual federal lobbying day on HIV, bringing together over 800 people living with HIV and other advocates to push legislators in the United States to appropriately address HIV. As the head of MPact, he collaborates with LGBTQ groups in over 30 different countries. MPact has brought attention globally to attempts at criminalizing gay sex, homophobic violence, and the disproportionate impact of HIV. MPact engages international funding and policy tables, such as the Global Fund, UNAIDS, and PEPFAR, for the needs of gay, bi, and other gender diverse people in the HIV response. Andy earned his doctorate in communication and culture from Howard University, as well as a master's in theater education at UCLA and a bachelor's in ethics studies at University of California, Berkeley. He's an award-winning teacher, activist, and researcher, widely published in academic articles, as well as co-editor of the book Intercultural Health Communication and the forthcoming Post-AIDS. Andy, welcome to your first GMSH conference. We are very lucky to have you here today. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Dane. Thank you all for having me. I was wishing that this would be in person and I was anticipating that. I appreciate all of you coming to see this talk and good morning from Montreal. So the title of my talk is Left Out: LGBTQ Communities, Queer Sex, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. Next slide. So as Dane said, I have an extensive history as an activist and a researcher. I actually came into the field in my early 20s in HIV, and it was my first job with benefits actually was in the HIV field when I was 20 years old. And I was very excited. And when I was around 27 or 28, I contracted HIV. And when I contracted HIV, they told me that I had 5 years to live, 10 if I was lucky. And it kind of set me off down some roads. And as one might imagine, and this was like 98. So they were still telling people that in 1998. Eventually, I decided to get a master's and get a PhD. So I got my PhD quite later and became faculty, a tenured faculty in the California State University system. So that's a little bit about me and where I come from in this world. Even as a faculty person, I didn't give up being an HIV advocate, and I'm very happy and proud to be the new executive director of MPact, a position I've held since March of this year. Next slide. So Danes gave a great backdrop for MPact. MPact does three things. We are a catalyst, we're advocates, and we convene. When I say we're a catalyst, we've helped build organizations and gay groups all over the world, including Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Western Africa, Central and South Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Asia Pacific. And we're very proud of that and our partnerships. As an advocate, we work very closely with what's called the key population networks. Key populations in the HIV response refer to gay men, gay and bisexual men, people with trans experience, people in prison, people who use drugs, and sex workers. And in some cases, migrants. And we work with the other key population networks, including GATE, which is a trans network, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, and the Global Network of Sex Worker Projects, to be able to effectively advocate for change at various tables, including the WHO, Global Fund, International AIDS Society, and USAID, which funds PEPFAR, as well as the UN agencies. As a convener, MPact often, we were founded at the International AIDS Conference in 2006, and MPact often hosts regional and national meetings. And we have in nearly every HIV conference, every international AIDS conference since our founding, we have had a pre-conference, a one-day summit where we bring our constituents, gay, bisexual, and other queer folks together to talk about policy issues and strategize. Next year, the International AIDS Conference, AIDS 2022, will be here in Montreal at the end of July and run through the beginning of August. And we are very happy that we will be doing a one-day summit called For Fuck's Sake. And it's going to be totally devoted to talking about gay sex because we feel like it's a good time to do that. And much of my talk today will be about that. And if you want more information, just email me. Next slide. So this was something I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, or as I struggled through the pandemic, and I'll just read the first part of it. Touch, a tool for intimacy and violation, a way of making sense of the body we are in through contact with another. Before coming out, I would hug people almost desperately, tight, trying to squeeze every emotional and physical sensation before it ended. Fear motivated this clinging, scared of being found out, and that the touch may not happen again. I still seek out the hold, though less thirstily, recognizing others' need for the solid pressure, the gentle passing impression. As a child, I preferred to be home alone, curled up reading. Being outside meant being called a sissy and the possibility of violence. In middle school, a pack of white girls decided to grab my hair and make fun of my skin, darker than theirs. As an adult, men made it clear that they wanted me, to feel me, and I let them. After contracting HIV, the feelings changed. I had to find new places to learn to be with men. Touch has brought me joy and connection, fear and loathing. My body has never been a simple place. During the pandemic, I felt trapped in my home, cut off from anyone except my dog, Ace, who passed away. This manifested as depression, major weight gain, and a return to daily heavy drinking. clicking, shopping, ordering, repeat. Grateful for the privilege to have life delivered. Sitting with myself alone, trying to make sense of this space. I continued teaching and writing articles and attending meetings, even though I wondered why. As weeks went on, online engagements became more insistent, filling up every space on my calendar. The screen time seemed to deaden life, still the air, add to the feelings of claustrophobia as we hunkered down. So I wrote that at the beginning of the pandemic, and there's the citation for it. And one of the things that happened for me when we all were told to work from home, a friend had, and my dog died. My dog Ace passed away after 15 years. And I didn't really know why I was in the US anymore. And a friend of mine had gone to Guadalajara in Mexico and invited me down, and I went. And for those people who don't know, Guadalajara is probably, I think it's the fourth largest city in Mexico, and it has a thriving queer community that's been there for a long time. So being in Guadalajara meant that I didn't have to deal with the COVID madness of the United States. There was also a presidential election happening, which I missed. I voted in it, but I missed the US media uproar from the previous administration, who we all know who that is. And I was able to find new life in Guadalajara, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In Mexico, the response to COVID was very different. Healthcare is not guaranteed in Mexico, and people in major cities tended to take COVID seriously. And people wore masks, they still do, temperature checks in every store, every restaurant, hand washing. And one of the things about Guadalajara is it's pretty temperate there. And so it's sunny pretty much all the time. So the restaurants and storefronts tend to be open windows. So there was a lot of ventilation happening. So it was really a way for me to kind of get back in touch with who I am and find community in this isolation. Next slide. So there are lots of myths about the LGBTQ community. I'm going to go through a few of them. We all know these as queer people, and I know that not everybody that's watching is part of our community, but these are myths that people often have about us. That we are double income, no kids, that there are two men involved in a relationship, and that's twice as much money, and there's no children to spend it on. My brother always says this about me. He always wonders why I'm single. If I had a partner, I could do more stuff because he has kids, so he can't do as much as I can. And of course, that's a myth. Gay people are not all wealthy. Most of us are not wealthy, just like most of us are not. Most of the general population is not wealthy. What we are targets for consumerism and credit cards. And many of us have really awful credit because of that. So this is one of the myths, right? That we are wealthy. Another myth is that gay marriage means that we're all equal, that the passage of gay marriage indicates that all of our struggles are over. And that's far from true. Many of us don't want to be married. I personally have been married and divorced. And that's what they don't tell you about gay marriage is there's gay divorce. And that's messy. So, one of the things, marriage is only one kind of legal protection and legal right. And there are many that we're excluded from. And I'll talk about that. LGBTQ people are fun and live for the party. This is why we get bachelorette parties that invade gay bars. Also because people believe gay bars are so safe and welcoming. They are safe and welcoming for some people, but not everyone feels safe in a gay bar because of body size, race, socioeconomic class, disability. There's lots of reasons, past trauma, why people don't feel comfortable. So I bring up the myths because they also have material impact. And when people believe these myths, they actually can have a horrible impact on things like asylum cases, where gay and bisexual men have a much harder time proving discrimination. In the US, there's been such a reduction in even allowing people to claim that being gay is discrimination. in asylum cases. And, that's partially because of this kind of popular myths about us. Next slide. So our realities are very different. And again, for the queer people in the audience, we all know this. Gay sex is outlawed in over 70 countries worldwide. We're not protected from discrimination in either education or employment in most parts of the world. Homophobic violence is real and continues to be a challenge. One of the things that's true about us is we're often underemployed, even if we have a higher education than the general population. And that's statistics that we found in a 10,000 person survey that we did at MPact. LGBTQ communities, we've had a disproportionate impact from the HIV epidemic, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we've often organized in urban settings around meeting places, bars, sex clubs, centers, service providers. This is a quote from one of our constituents, a gay man in the Philippines, who was talking about just getting basic health information. For those individuals who have issues with fitness, nutrition, maintaining a healthy body, when you're in these general health settings and you just want advice on how to get fit and healthy, but you'll get ostracized for being gay, for your gender identity. And in this interview, he was actually talking about how difficult it is when you are gender nonconforming or effeminate to even be in these kinds of general health settings where people will snicker or mock you in some way and make you feel uncomfortable. And that's the reality that we have to face. We know this about our community, but these narratives don't circulate in popular media. And that's one of the problems, is that people actually believe what they see in popular media. Sorry. Next slide. So one of the reasons I'm interested in why MPact is focusing on gay sex for AIDS 2022 is because queer sex is still considered deviant. Our sex and sexuality, our sex practices are often considered risks, not part of our sexuality. And health research often only looks at our sex as the ways it makes us vulnerable to STIs or other kinds of diseases. I always bring up the fact that, medical doctors will ask you if you're having sex, and it's a yes or no question, right? Are you sexually active? But they never ask us questions like, are we having the sex we want? Do we have problems getting sex? Do we, how do we negotiate sex? What kinds of sex are we even having? There remains little comprehensive sex ed on queer sex. So if you think about it, most people get their information from pornography, and comprehensive sex ed for queers is non-existent, right? Comprehensive sex ed is pretty difficult to find. I mean, whenever somebody says that they do sex ed, I have to point out, like, do you even talk about masturbation? Which is probably the most common sex act, right? Almost everybody I know masturbates. And it's yet something that people have a hard time talking about. So I think when we talk about this, we have to remember that the laws against gay sex are about the sex act, not about our identities. And so, that provokes certain things like, in some countries, they do anal exams of men to see if they've had gay sex, which obviously is not an accurate way of identifying a gay man. And it's incredibly offensive and incredibly intrusive. And also, these anal exams are performed by law enforcement. And let me tell you, most cops probably aren't trained in how to do a rectal exam correctly. Just saying. And so I think one of the reasons why it's important to focus on queer sex, this is our second pandemic that we've survived. This particular pandemic brings up a lot of issues that we've had, especially around touch and being able to find other people and feeling isolated. Next slide. So another complication is this intersection of HIV stigma and homophobia. We live in the intersection of multiple kinds of discrimination. And when I became executive director of MPact, the first thing that happened in my first week was Ghana. And what happened in Ghana was the police came to a gay center, shut it down, and then went to the people's homes who ran the center and waited for them to arrest them. And we got Facebook message posts and direct messages asking for help. And that was my first week on the job. And we worked with UNAIDS to find them safe places to live for a little while. And there are great organizations like Rainbow Railroad, which is a Canada-based group, which does this work, this amazing work all the time. And there's so much need all over the world. This is a tweet from a case that happened over the summer. This was in Cancun, which is a tourist resort in Mexico, primarily. In Cancun, this young queer person disclosed at a party that they were HIV positive. And that night they were kidnapped, tortured all night, and killed. And what horrified the local activists was that the police refused to even investigate the crime. Apparently, police think that investigating murders, gay murders, will disturb the tourists. And so the local activists had protests, they reached out to MPact, they asked us for help. They wanted to make sure that the story was told in other media, in English-speaking media, because a couple newspapers had picked it up in Spanish, but they felt that the English-speaking media would put more pressure on the government. And so we helped, and we got stories in 7 different venues about this story, about this young queer kid who I think is 22, and the person, and then after the stories came out, the federal government instructed the local police to investigate. The murderer ended up being the kid's roommate, who apparently they had had some kind of sexual relationship of some kind. And so, you know, I bring that up because we do have vulnerability in all kinds of places because of HIV stigma, because of homophobia. But, you know, there's also not just murder, like murder is a horrible thing, but this kind of HIV stigma is prevalent even today in the queer community. Can we play the video? This is the Brisbane AIDS Foundation brought this intervention out in 2017.
Hey, sexy.
Hi. Want to meet?
I'm up for some fun.
Let's play house.
Sorry, what? I'll be the door and
You can slam me on.
Wanna fuck?
Pick.
Nice face. It'd look better with my cum on it.
Are you clean?
Oh gosh.
I'm paused but undetectable.
Nah, I'm out. Can't risk it.
Why? Are you?
Fuck no, I'm clean.
You're vile. That's fucked up, you slag.
What the fuck's wrong with you? Why are you on here with your disease?
Yuck. Oh, I don't want to say that.
You should be ashamed. You're a walking disease.
You're a disgrace.
You vile piece of shit.
Go and spread your disease with some other poor fucker. Go fuck yourself.
Wow.
Flocking, go fuck yourself, cause no one else will.
Wow, that hurts.
That's fucked up. I felt like a shit person for saying that.
Is that a real conversation?
Can't be.
That's horrible.
It was hard to say that stuff.
Yeah. Shook up.
Yeah.
It's hatred, isn't it? It's just a hate conversation. But that, you know, there needs to be more education. I'm here to start the conversation.
Start the conversation. Start the conversation.
I'm here to start the conversation.
Stop the stigma.
So, you know, this intervention, appeared in Australia. I love it. But for those of us who use Grindr and other social media apps, this is not a surprise to us, especially if we're living with HIV. Um, you know, uh, People living with HIV are often trolled on those sites. And even today with PrEP and viral suppression, U equals U, people still, call us sick, call us dirty. Yeah. And so that's where we live. We live at these intersections, even within our own community. Next slide. So we've had HIV around for 40 years now. Happy birthday, HIV. And it's interesting because it's interesting for lots of reasons. But, originally HIV was called gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. And part of what that framing did was it piled onto homophobia really easily. And people were able to, number one, exclude women. That was one of the key things, was it excluded cis women. It excluded all kinds of people that got HIV. After that, there was the 4H group, which was heroin users, homosexuals, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. And it still excluded women and all kinds of people. And one of the things that's happened in HIV that we've seen is it's had this incredible impact. This is actually the first report of HIV in 1981, which is that 5 young men, all active homosexuals, were treated for biopsy-confirmed pneumocystis carinii pneumonia at 3 different hospitals in Los Angeles. And this would become what we know as HIV. So there's been a huge impact in the queer community, partially because of the high mortality. If you think about it, most of us, if you came out in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, you were probably touched by HIV in very, very, very material ways. Our friends died, our lovers died, people we never got to have sex with died. It was one of the lessons from the 90s for me, is that when you see a hot person that you want to have sex with them. Go for it, because they might die. And it's that kind of mortality has left a mark on us. And whether it's because our leaders died or organizations fell apart, or for our own personal grief and our community grief, it left a mark. And one of the things that that mark means to me is sometimes when people compare COVID and HIV, I kind of don't really get it, because it is different. And we it's when people are like, oh, HIV negative people will often say to me, oh, I know what it's like to live through HIV now that I lived through COVID. And I'm like, did your friends, lovers die? Did your families kick you out and not speak to you again? Did strangers have to bury you? Because that's kind of what happened. I'm from a generation that went to weekly drag shows and put money into a pot to help pay for funerals. So anyways, that's some of the differences, right? Gay, bi, and trans people constitute the vast majority of new HIV diagnoses in the US, Canada, Western Europe, Latin America, and Asia. The vast majority. But does the funding match? Do you think the funding matches? Next slide. So this was a report done by AIDS Funds, which is a Dutch ministry partnership, a philanthropic organization that looked at funding between 2016 and 2018. There was 57 billion US in global donor funding. So should I? Hold on. So, okay. So this was a study done by AIDS Funds, which is a Dutch philanthropic organization, and they looked at HIV funding from 2016 to 2018. Repeating that because we transitioned interpreters. So in that time between 2016 and 2018, there was 57 billion US dollars in global donors to treat the virus and combat its spread. And of that $57 billion, gay and bisexual men were only allocated 1%. And remember, we are the vast majority of new cases in much of the world. So we got 1% of that. Programs for trans people got 0.06% of that total. 0.06% for trans people. The vast majority of this funding, vast, so we've done 1% for gay men, 0.06% for trans people. So that's 1.06%. Not, I'm a university professor, that's a failing grade. If you get 1% on a test, you have failed. So part of the challenge here is that most of this allocation was channeled to what's called general population in about 135 lower and middle income countries. And this general population isn't even all the people most at risk for HIV, right? They're not looking at sex workers. They're not looking at people who use drugs. They're not looking at migrants. They're not looking at people who are in prison or incarcerated in some way. They're looking at general population, and that term is usually used to discuss some kind of normative gender identity, normative socioeconomic class, normative experience. And there are very few places in the world that have a generalized epidemic. Africa, the continent of Africa is a big one, and they're the vast majority of cases. But even in Africa, we've seen 30%, last year, 30% of new HIV diagnoses in Africa were among sex workers, people of trans experience, gay and bisexual men, and people who use drugs, 30%. So the HIV funding doesn't match, and this has an impact when we talk about COVID and we talk about how our communities can recover. Next slide. I think I flipped these slides on accident. Okay. So where's the gay sex? As our organizations have developed through the nominal HIV funding that's been there, HIV and LGBTQ organizations have professionalized and institutionalized. And that kind of has a real, when we professionalize, it has a real effect in how we engage our communities, how we speak, who our audience is. And I want to give you an example from my own organization of how we're developing our voice. So I'm not going to criticize other organizations. I'm using my own organization. So the first video will be something that came out several years ago. And the second video will be something that we did just recently. So I want you to take a look at the two videos and then we'll discuss. Can we play the videos?
I'm working with Youth Voices Count, which is a regional network of young LGBTQ plus people in Asia and Pacific.
My organization is India's first LGBT organization which is working for the LGBT rights and the health issues.
I am a board member at MSMGF, representing the youth reference group as a young gay man living with HIV.
I am a gay man living with HIV. I've been living with HIV now for 12 years.
A lot of my work is around mobilizing community members for sexual health issues. Our approach is community-led. It's very important for us to be in constant communication with community members to make sure that we are relevant, that we do represent their realities, and that the community would have a sense of ownership of what we're doing.
It's really important for local.
Hi, I'm Mama Celeste, and we're here at the Anal About My Health obstacle course. I'm here with Cochina Rude. Cochina, how are you feeling today?
I'm in it to win it.
Today we're going to get Cochina on prep. Let's go!
And they're off. Cochina's first obstacle is trick or trade. This handsome stranger is just Cochina's type, short, hairless, and dumb. Well, what's the first thing that she should do?
So in the first video, we have, it goes on for about 3 minutes, but I was bored, so I asked them to just stop it at some point. In the first video, we have a lot of our partners who are great, fantastic people, very community-based. But if you notice, the script of it is very stilted, and our audience is not, it's pretty bureaucratic, that audience. I think that as these organizations professionalize, we sometimes forget to stay community rooted and really be able to practice what we're trying to say. So it's good to speak to the UN. It's good to speak to country governments and be able to get respect at the health departments and the ministries of health. And we also need to be able to speak to our constituents in a way that they get. The second video is from a series we did called Anal About My Health, which you can find online. We did a whole series of, my former communications person is Mama Celeste, the drag persona that you saw in the video. And in that video, Mama Celeste takes their friend through an obstacle course of sex in order to find PrEP. And you know, the idea behind it was that at some point, you know, we do have to have the respect of other people, and we need to be able to speak to our communities in ways that they enjoy, the ways that they want to engage us. You know, that first video, I don't know how you all felt about it. They could have played the full 3 minutes. You can find it online. But it's, they actually say things like, we believe in being sex positive because sex positive is really important. And the thing about being sex positive is I also believe sex is a practice. It's not just a theory. So, you know, it's like, if you're going to say you're sex positive, things should be sex positive. Things should be sexy. Many of the images that you're going to see throughout this presentation are actually taken from some content creation we did in Mexico City 2 months ago. And one of the challenges we have at MPact is that there's so few images of queer people of color that are available online, that are believable, that are real. And, you know, so one of the things that we're doing is we're actually creating our own content because we do need more queer imagery. We do need things that reflect our realities. So we do need to be able to speak to our funders, and there's a reason why. Next slide. This was actually supposed to be before the previous one, so let's all pretend that happened the way that it was supposed to. Okay. So this lack of consistent funding for our community centers has meant that a lot of them have shut down. One of the challenges here, this is actually in Merced, California. It's a pretty liberal city. It's a university town, and this is the Merced LGBT Community Center, and it was closed. It got closed during COVID. Many of the, COVID closed a lot of spaces. And so this is one place where they just went out of business. They went out of business because our budgets are tenuous and erratic. Often we get funded as organizations to do things, to do X, Y, Z when the community needs A, B, C. And so we have to find a way to reconcile the funding and the community needs, and how we are going to bring those together and be able to effectively meet the community's needs. When we look at clinics, HIV is a very expensive illness to treat. And so for those HIV service organizations who became clinics, which is a very popular thing right now, people think that if they become a clinic, then it will solve their financial problems. The problem is HIV is actually really expensive to treat. And it's part of that is because HIV requires more time and more clinical staff than other health conditions. If you compare HIV to like pregnancy, for instance, for a clinic, who would you rather have? A person living with HIV or a pregnant woman? The pregnant woman, because you get the pregnancy, but then she comes in for 18 years to give that with that kid. And so if you're running a clinic that needs to make a profit, you want the pregnant woman, not the person living with HIV, because people living with HIV, especially as we age, we get more and more comorbidities, right? I'm going to turn 50 next year. Don't tell anyone. And I take the same blood pressure medication and other medication that my mother takes. So yeah, she's like, how did you get old so quickly? And part of that is HIV. Just aging with HIV does present a lot of comorbidities that become more and more expensive to treat. Okay. Next slide. This is an example of some of the pictures we took in Mexico City. So now we reach the COVID-19 pandemic. For most of us in the queer community, this is our second go around on the pandemic ride. Health services have been disrupted globally. All distribution systems have been disrupted. You know, I don't think many people understood how interlinked economies are because of globalization, and the ways in which we rely so much on these kind of globalized distribution systems to get anything now: food, technology, goods, any kind of goods. So, you know, I find it fascinating. You know, one of the things, I was at lunch with friends yesterday here in Montreal, and they all were commenting on how expensive food has gotten in Canada and food has gotten in Montreal. And one of the news stories was that restaurant prices will go up in the coming year because of the impact of COVID, because things are costing more. And I get it. I totally get why restaurants would need to do it. Most restaurants live at the very thin line of survival. And so I get why they would need to do it. But yeah, it was fascinating to me to see how COVID has had this effect that continues, this domino effect around our economies, and around how much things cost. And it's interesting because MPact is a remote office now. We don't have an office, and we're never going back to that. And so I also think about that, like all of these spaces where businesses suddenly realize they don't need a space, a physical space, and what that impact might mean for our communities. Another issue around COVID is that movement is restricted. Health services have been disrupted globally, all over the world. You know, the first thing that happened in HIV clinics, for instance, is that in much of the world, there's not a separate HIV clinic. It's one clinic that you get your HIV meds in. And with COVID, you would have to go in to get your meds every week in some places. Some places, they only give you a week's supply, so you have to go in every week. But every week, you're being exposed potentially to COVID. And so that became a challenge in many country settings. And what happened was they ended up giving people 1 month of medication instead of 1 week, as a way of reducing the potential for exposure to COVID. Movement's restricted for multiple reasons. In Latin America, something really interesting. One way that they managed the movement of people was in much of Latin America, everyone has an ID card with a number on it. And in many countries, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, if you had an even number ID number, like if the last number was even, you could go out on one day. And if you had an odd number at the end of your ID card, you go out the next day. So it just alternated like that. The reason why this is important for queer people is that in Peru, they decided to do gender. So on one day, men were allowed out, and on the next day, women were allowed out. And it alternated, men, women, men, women. Now, what do you think the challenge there is? So trans people and gender nonconforming people got targeted really, really viciously under this process. And there are all these videos online, they're horrible. Again, we got these calls that were like, we need help. And basically the police, you know, they didn't do like, hey, what gender are you? Questions. They made people show their genitalia in the streets. They made people do dances, sing songs about what gender they were. And, you know, considering that Peru is generally considered a more liberal leaning country, it was pretty shocking and horrifying to watch these videos and realize just how this one public health mitigation strategy could so viciously target us and our communities. And, that's something else that happens is, you know, we're seeing just how we can be targeted. Next slide. I'm not used to talking this much in a row, so sorry about that. I had to take little water breaks. I'm also not used to speaking to an audience I can't see, so this is also interesting. What are you all doing on the other side of the screen? Okay. So we had a huge impact of COVID on LGBTQ life, right? So people had to go back to their families in some places, and that's meant going back into the closet. So when if people had to move back into their families, some people went back into the closet. If you were on PrEP or HIV medications, that meant sometimes people just stopped taking their medications because they didn't want their families to find out that they were gay, that they were queer in some way. Also, not every family is supportive. And so often, you know, being forced to move back into a family that's not supportive could have mental health challenges also. There's a loss of jobs, right? I think all of us know people who lost their jobs in COVID. Certain industries just don't exist anymore. And also, like, there's been a rise in people who engage in sex work, which is great. And we need to make sure that they have the resources and the safety to do it, right? I think if you know anyone in their 20s, I'm just shocked at how many of them are either on OnlyFans or just for fans. And when I talk to my college students, I always tell them, like, somebody you know is on the site. And if you don't know, you need to ask people. And part of that is because it's a safe way. It's a somewhat safe way to engage in sex work, right? As long as you know some of the rules of it. But webcamming, lots of different ways to kind of pursue sex work nowadays. There's also been a disruption of health services. I talked briefly about HIV clinics, but it goes across all health issues. So if you're trans and you're going to a medical doctor regularly for your health, that was disrupted during COVID. OBGYNs, all different kinds of medical professions, a lot of the health services were reallocated to COVID, which is understandable in a global pandemic. But it also means that we have to be mindful that those resources get redirected back to our communities, that they don't stay focused outside of our communities. We need to think about making sure that LGBT health and HIV remain at front of mind for some of these governments. One of the other things that happened was safe spaces were shut down. So not just queer centers, but gay bars, queer bars, bathhouses, sex places were shut down. And that has a huge impact in our community life and our community well-being and our own mental health. I was speaking to a student the other day, queer student, who is an introvert, and they were telling me that the really horrible thing about living through Montreal's lockdown was they didn't realize how much social life, even though they don't know very many people, that how much the social life of the city meant for their mental health. And so the fact that everyone was locked down and they no longer were seeing people, the person at the corner store, the person on the train, that lack of engagement really affected their mental health. And so it goes beyond just like our queer spaces. It's, all the spaces were shut down. The queer spaces have a particular impact on us. And this is one of our constituents in Kenya. The few opportunities that we had to get together just disappeared. Blackmail and extortion have increased. It's always been an issue in this country, but it's just skyrocketed. And the violence also on gay men. So Kenya is a context where gay sex is criminalized. And one of the things that happens in contexts where gay sex is criminalized is that apps like Grindr are weaponized. And if you don't know what Grindr is, then I don't know what you're doing at this conference. It's a social media app that uses geolocation for men to meet each other, for people to meet each other. So one of the challenges with using these apps in a criminalized location, and even not in a criminalized location, it could also be in a place where there's just a lot of stigma to be gay, is that people will take screen captures of every single profile on the app and then go through social media, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and look to see if they can find the person. And then if they can, they'll show the pictures and blackmail them. Say like, I'm gonna reveal to your family, I know who they are now, I see your Facebook, unless you do X, Y, Z for me, unless you give me a certain amount of money. And this is actually very common in certain parts of the world. And it skyrocketed during COVID. Also, people were not cruising in gay bars anymore, or in other settings like a bathhouse. And they were cruising in spaces where they didn't necessarily know the people that they were cruising, and became vulnerable to violence and blackmail and extortion. And so that's some examples of the impact of COVID on LGBTQ lives. Yeah, next slide. Is COVID over? So there's this big push in a lot of spaces to say like, we're going to get back to normal, you know, and you know, COVID's over, you know, we can stop all of these things. We can stop, you know, wearing masks. We can stop, you know, all of these things. In the US, it's like a fever, where people are head on fire screaming about this, that COVID's over, that we have to go back to normal. COVID is not over. The medical mistrust is real. There are people that honestly will not get a vaccine and don't trust it, and don't trust what their governments tell them anymore. We all know these people. When I moved to Canada, I put on my Instagram that I had my Canadian work papers, and people were like, oh, I'm going to visit you. I'm going to visit you. I'm going to visit you. And then my response was, well, COVID has a vaccine requirement. And 3 people that I know, all liberal, all people that, you know, are gay friendly and all that, started like screaming on my Instagram, like, that's unconstitutional. One person said that, and I said, I didn't know you were an expert in Canada's constitution. Like, huh. And he was like, oh, it's another country. Yeah, it's another country. So people were really outraged, and 3 people that I did not suspect were kind of anti-vaccine were anti-vaccine. I just brought a group of young gay men to the ballet in New York, because I feel like that's part of my responsibility as an older gay man, is to show culture and blah, 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 blah. And to help younger gay men feel comfortable in spaces like a ballet center. So anyways, I bring them there, and they were horrified that the ballet required vaccine cards. And they're all like vegan and progressive and all that. But they said things like, oh, I don't want anything unnatural in my body. And the person who said that, I looked at him and I said, you're on PrEP. Like, are you kidding? Like, you eat McDonald's. Like, that's not even food. It's a chemistry experiment. Like, I just don't, the logic just didn't make sense to me. But, you know, I realized that it's not just kind of what I would consider fringe parts of the society that have questions about the vaccine. It's actually much more common than we think. And we need to figure out ways to engage our communities so that people do get protection, and we can get to the other side of COVID. There has been disproportionate vaccine rollout. So across the world, we've seen, like in Senegal, there's only 4% coverage. And you know, that there's just disproportionate vaccine rollout, which is going to have a huge effect next year for travel, because more and more countries will have vaccine requirements. This is Ten. He's an actor in Thailand. And this is Ten showing that he got his COVID-19 vaccine. Well, Ten had to fly to LA to get a COVID vaccine because they weren't available in Bangkok for him. So luckily, Ten's boyfriend is a lawyer in LA and flew him out. Flew him out to get vaccinated. And actually, I know a few people that were lucky enough to know people in the US that just flew them out in order to get them vaccinated. But that's, you know, that's a very privileged group of people. And the other thing is that there's this big push to stop our public health mitigation practices, whether it's mask wearing inside or hand washing, and we have to keep doing that. You know, one of the great things about the last year was that the flu was at an all-time low. And, it just makes you realize that, a lot of people don't wash their hands. But we have to think about these things when we think about, is COVID over? And what does normal mean? I would actually say that there was no normal, or the normal that was there wasn't working for all of us. And so we really need to think about ways that we can restructure our social lives, our personal lives, our sexual lives, so that they work for us. Just the example of like my office doesn't exist anymore. Like, that's a big move for an organization to say, I don't need an office anymore. It's money sunk down the drain, and we have to figure out new ways to interact. That's one of the things that I realized in this kind of remote office, is that when you're in an office together, there's this assumption that if we can see you work, then you're working. And it's a bizarre assumption because, I'm a university professor, and I've realized that there are some students who are just shopping while I lecture, and that's okay. But like, they're on their computer and it looks like they're very busy, but they're shopping, and that's fine. And the same is true in the workplace. Surveillance doesn't make people more productive. And that's one of the things that I'm learning as a manager in a remote office, is that, we have to think of different ways that we can engage each other and how we conceptualize even working. Need water? Hold on. Okay, next slide. So against the backdrop of COVID-19 is migration. And I already mentioned Rainbow Railroad, who does amazing work. And migration has become one of the major health issues globally. And it's shocking to me how little, or how well, how misunderstood migration is. My family are refugees. We fled a war in the 1970s, and our welcome was very different than what people get today. We fled a war in the 70s, and the local newspapers ran stories about how wonderful it is that this brown, non-English speaking family is in our community. And there are 25 people living in one home. And I think about what that headline would be today. And it wouldn't be a human interest story. It would be, they're invading your neighborhood. Why can't they learn English? Things like that. And you're like, because we don't, like, not everybody does. But people migrate due to a wide variety of reasons. There are economic reasons people migrate, for jobs, for lack of jobs. There are political reasons why people migrate, the new parties in office, they're being persecuted. There are national reasons people migrate. Look at the collapse of Afghanistan. There are familial reasons people migrate, like people want to be with their families, or people want to get away from their families. And there are personal ones. And now there's climate ones. I should update that. Climate change is real, and more and more people will be migrating due to climate change. But this affects LGBTQ people in a particular way. Queer people migrate because it's not safe, because we want a different life, because we insist on having a different life, because we don't want to be killed, because we don't want to be arrested. Not everyone wants to leave their country, but often migrants are forced out. And, and that we have to keep that front of mind when we think about migration. This was Nobody Flees Without a Reason. I saw it in Berlin at a gay bar, and it really made me smile, because this gay bar had just hand painted this on their front sign: "Nobody flees without a reason." And when I talked to the bartender, he said the bar owner put it up because he got so fed up with all the anti-migrant rhetoric that was going around Berlin, and continues to go around Berlin. And he just wanted to remind people, like, it's like nobody flees without a reason. we're not, people aren't walking across countries because they want to. You don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I think I'm going to take my whole family and just walk across 3 countries. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about what our communities look like now, what they can look like, and what we can do to support people that are fleeing. Next slide. So I'm intrigued. I brought up this idea of normal, and a lot of countries are looking at COVID-19 in the past tense, like it's in the rear view mirror of a car. And they're saying that they're going to build back better. And often these recovery plans in multiple countries, when they're thinking about them, they're looking at the infrastructure, they're looking at economic recovery, they're looking at health services. And those are all really important things, but they're not looking at migration, they're not looking at human rights. And I wonder, as these countries invest billions, and it's billions, into building back better, what that looks like and what kinds of issues will be central and what won't be. So if we think of the Global Fund had what's called C19RM, which is the COVID-19 response mechanism. And they had to redistribute almost $4 billion to Global Fund receiving countries to help them with COVID mitigation and recovery. And there'll be another round. And when we started working on it, and we started working on it in country at MPact with various countries, it was kind of shocking because the Global Fund mechanism is called the CCM, which is the Community Consultation Mechanism. And that's where communities are supposed to be able to input their plans. But in countries, many countries didn't realize that queer people, sex workers, people who use drugs, would also be affected by COVID and in very specific ways and would need support. And so even in countries where they had included these groups in HIV mechanisms, when they talked about COVID, they did not include them. And because they didn't realize that it affected us. And in some places, it was probably just an oversight, and in other places, it was malicious. And it got played out in very specific ways. Like people were kicked out of group chats, meetings happened that not everyone was told about. And so when we think about building back better, I think we need to think about for who and how, and what are we going to really prioritize. Next slide. Will the queer communities be involved? One of the things that I did this year was I worked with the UNAIDS to help facilitate the UN high-level meeting on HIV. And that had a political declaration that came out, and there were several countries that always wanted to take out gay, bi, and trans people in every place we appeared. And many countries said it's because they didn't have gay, bi, or trans people. Many countries said they don't allow, it's not a cultural thing to allow for that identity. And so we really had to fight to keep gay, bi, and trans people in the mix for the political declaration on HIV from the United Nations. And so that shocked me because it's HIV, we're 40 years into the epidemic, and we're still fighting to even be acknowledged that we're part of this community. So when we think about building back better, do you think queer communities will be involved in that? Do you think we're going to be, that the LGBTQ communities are going to be central to that? The answer is no. I don't think there's going to be any country that prioritizes the LGBTQ community. So what can we do? Next slide. This is an example, by the way, of the pictures we took in Mexico City. You're not going to find that on Google image searches or in what do they call it? They call it stock photos, right? You're not going to find that in your stock photo companies. Okay, so we're working with 4 groups to develop community recovery plans, queer community recovery plans. And the 4 groups are M Coalition, which is a group based in the Middle East, Africa Gay contra la SIDA, which is AGCS. AGCS is a West African organization. ECOM, which is based out of Eastern Europe. And Gay Latino, which is a network of Latin American and Caribbean organizations. And we're going to be developing these community recovery plans in the next year. And we're asking all the regions to look at economic, political, and cultural recovery of LGBT communities in their respective regions. And the reason we want to do this is we want to show the Global Fund, we want to show UNAIDS, we want to show WHO what it would mean to actually have recovery plans for our communities. What does that mean? What does that look like for us? How many safe spaces were destroyed? How many media companies went out of business? How many, what's our utility on, what's our usage of social media? What platforms are we using? How can we reconvene? What's the vaccine rollout look like? These are all questions that will be in these community recovery plans. Next slide. So we believe in community-led responses. This is another picture from Mexico City. So Gay Latino, when we talked to Gay Latino about it, they said, Latin America remains the most unequal region in the world, and this fact has been accentuated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fragile and almost non-existent safety nets and absent welfare states have unleashed numerous crises alongside the health crisis. The region has been plunged into social unrest, protests, and a drastic reduction in already highly precarious living conditions. So Gay Latino is based in Paraguay. And one of the things that happens when you actually allow communities to take the lead is that communities can articulate what's happening to us. And communities know our priorities, and community-led responses are more likely to define the problem, the challenges, and the solutions for the communities that are relevant. If you think of most of HIV right now, it's a biomedical response. A lot of HIV is moving into clinic services, and those are important, yes, but our communities have many more challenges than just how many pills do we take. As a person living with HIV, I get so bored when that's the only conversation. Are you treatment adherent? It's like, I always make a joke about AIDS conferences that it's like, if I have to see one more presentation where they tell me how many pills people take, Jesus. What about housing? What about education? What about quality of life? These are all things that matter to me. What about my sex life? And so one of the things that Gay Latino highlights here in this is that they're really highlighting the fact that in Latin America, COVID is raging across Latin America, partially because they never had health infrastructures in many countries that were really heavily, deeply invested in. And so the HIV response is very underfunded in Latin America and the Caribbean. And part of what happened with that is that because there were no HIV clinics, or it was very rare, then there were no clinics for people to go to under COVID. The other thing is that the economies in the queer communities were already fragile. These are fragile economies. If you look at places like Venezuela, Venezuela has been extremely fragile for a long time. And this has led to a huge migration out of Venezuela. And in fact, if you go to Colombia, Mexico, a lot of South America right now, you'll meet Venezuelans because a lot of my friends who are Venezuelan, they talk about like, they didn't want to leave Venezuela at all. They love Venezuela, but they left because there were no jobs, there's no food. And so they found jobs in other countries and send money back. And I think, that's something when we think about what community-led responses can do, we can really articulate the needs of the community beyond how many pills we take, beyond treatment adherence. Next slide. Because health is more than our individual clinical outcomes. I say this all the time because I speak with a lot of doctors and a lot of health ministries. Communities are really vital. They're places where we get resources, where we can make strategies, where we make connection. So, you know, if you think about, you know, the gay village where you live or the neighborhood, you know where it is, right? If you live in an urban area, you know where it is. That there is one, that you can probably buy lube there. You can probably find resources if you want to be on PrEP. If you need HIV medication, you can probably find it at a community organization or find a referral to it, find access to those things. Also in communities, we tell each other where not to go. We tell each other when it's not safe. We tell each other, we share which drug dealers have good drugs and which drug dealers step on their drugs or you run a risk. We share this information with each other, and that's in communities. And that's one of the reasons we need to look at how our communities function to know how our own health functions, right? Culture is incredibly important because it makes us legible to ourselves and each other. And what I mean by that is we need to take into account that culture is an organizing system, right? That people, cultures are, everyone knows when they're accepted in a culture and when they're excluded in a culture. And that's part of how we need to understand our communities, is being able to make our communities as accessible as possible, to make our communities as robust as possible. It's to really be able to make people feel included by the ways that we speak, by the ways that we by the ways that we open our doors, by the ways that we hold space for people. And you know, we all know when we're excluded from spaces. We all know that. And so we know that when we're excluded, and we know when we are included. You know, I'm happy that there's more and more ASL happening in these kinds of events, because ASL interpretation is a bare minimum. And it should be where we start with accessibility. Interpretation is where we start. Language justice is real. We all don't speak the same language. And those things are important. And it's not just language, it's the ways that we hold space. It's the ways that we it's the ways that we engage each other. One of my close friends who passed away earlier this year, Marco Castro Bojorquez. I'm gonna get through this without crying about him. Yeah, okay. So Marco was a person living with HIV, somebody with very visible mental health and substance use issues, a queer person from Mexico, fled Mexico because of homophobic violence. I worked with Marco for several years as part of the US People Living with HIV caucus. Marco always spoke about language justice, but Marco, because of his substance use and mental health needs, sometimes showed up in spaces in ways that other people didn't appreciate, and often made him feel less than and excluded. So we were in a meeting once with a very large gay rights organization, and we were brought in to talk about diversity in their organization and what they could do to improve it. And Marco got very nervous in the space and started shaking, and he started pacing the room, and the people from the organization didn't really know what to do with him and asked him if he wanted to leave. And I reached out and I said, "Do you just need to be held?" And he said, "Yes." And so he sat on my lap for the rest of the meeting, and I just held him. And it was kind of funny because I think it's a very simple thing that we can do for each other, is figure out what we need to stay in the space. And the group that we met with kind of freaked out. And I was like, "You're a gay rights organization. You're freaking out because two men are touching?" Like, girl, please. But I bring that up because I do think that Marco did teach me and taught many of us the importance of making sure that spaces allow for different kinds of presentation and different ways for people to show up. And that's what I mean by culture. Context. So context is also part of our health. Mobility and agency play a role in our health. So whether we believe we can move and whether we believe we have control over parts of our lives, or if we do have control over our lives, right? So the fear of violence, housing, the portability of benefits, stigma, and economic opportunities, these can all restrict our movement, right? If we can't afford to move someplace, or we can't afford our apartment, or we can't afford, we can't afford just any kind of housing, then what are we going to do? And where can you go? In Montreal, one of the challenges is that you see a lot of people from Quebec who move into Montreal because they're queer, because they don't fit in where they're from. And the cost of living in Montreal has skyrocketed in the last 10 years. And you can see its impact. You can see the impact of that cost of living escalation. Portability of benefits can keep people trapped if you're living with HIV, for instance, where you get your HIV services at one place. And that can make you feel like you can't move anywhere, that you can't leave a place, even if it's stigmatizing or there's violence. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, wait. Oh, no, sorry. Stay. All the orange starts to look alike after a while. Why did we choose orange for our colors? So one of the lessons from COVID-19, and anybody who works in an organization, anybody who's engaged anything in the last 2 years, has seen the importance of having accessible communication platforms. That people need to be able to use the platforms. They need to be able to engage the platforms. One of the challenges is that many of our community organizations and health providers aren't necessarily great at using social media. So I bring that up not because, I'm mea culpa too. MPact has the same issue where we're still struggling to learn how to use these platforms. Dane and I were joking earlier in the week about the fact that, if you look at this convening was really thought out as an online space and really thought out in very, I think, useful ways. So it's not just a Zoom room. It's a lot of things. There's a lot of different thoughts that go into like the packages that roll up and the music and how we're even able to share this space with you, both live and the recorded versions. So I think that that's kind of important that we have to start thinking in that way. I also don't think our communities are now so used to being able to attend virtual events that we're really going to have to think through, how do we do events? How do we bring people together in this kind of new hybrid world? And it's not all, you can't just flick on a webcam and put it in a room. You need to do some work around thinking around how to make that as enjoyable as possible for the virtual audience. The other problem with communication is that not all communication platforms are safe for us to use, and it's important to know which ones are safe and which ones aren't. So if you think of like, I use the example of Grindr and other hookup apps. Those can be quite risky in certain countries. And in fact, in Egypt, for instance, everybody tells you don't get on Grindr. It's just the police. And so I will trust people who tell me that too, by the way. You don't have to tell me twice. If you tell me that it's police and they're trying to catfish people, I'm good. I don't need to be on Grindr. But we need to remember that not all communication platforms are safe for us to use. I was, like harm reduction programs, for instance, that went online, they have to think about these things. How do you keep the identities anonymized or confidential with some of these platforms when these platforms capture data? And also people are engaging these platforms in fairly public spaces or in homes where people can hear them. And so how do we create spaces where people can do that and really protect their identities? Next slide. So I think, we have, as we move through this pandemic that we're in, and we need to remember that sex is one way that gay, bi, and other queer folks have had to connect. And, in my life, sex has actually been one of the ways in which I made friends, in which I met people. And that's been, a key part of how I've constructed my social life. I'm also from a generation that would have sex with our friends first and then be friends. And I don't know if that's true of every generation, but it was definitely my experience. And when I bring up sex, we have to think about how we're going to re-engage sexually. Our communities are more diverse than ever with new practices and identities. We have to, I think we need to be more realistic about who's in our community and how we engage them. So people are being much more upfront about kink and fetish. There are trans men in our community, and we need to learn about how to engage trans men and how we can help welcome them into our community and engage with them in a way that is consensual. And our communities, I really want us to think about how we can make our organizations and our communities be inclusive and expansive, and how can we create spaces where we can have these dialogues and really be able to get down into what it means to be queer today. Because being queer today is not the same as it was at the beginning of the HIV epidemic, or even at the beginning of HIV treatment. Being queer today means something different. I'm going to close with a quote from Ocean Vuong, who's a Vietnamese gay poet. And Ocean says, "Being queer saved my life. Often we see queerness as deprivation, but when I look at my life, I saw that queerness demanded an alternative innovation from me. I had to make alternative routes. It made me curious. It made me ask, is this enough for me?" And the next slide will have my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that really wonderful presentation that I think encompasses a lot of themes and a lot of lived experiences that certainly resonated for me, and I hope so for everyone who's joining us. As you say, it is a little bit awkward. Andrew and I can see each other, but not all of your faces at home or at work. But we do have some time for Q&A and some discussion. I think you've given us a lot to chew on, and so we'll give it a moment for questions and reflections to come in, and participants can submit those through the chat function on your screen. And I'm also going to rely on my fabulous team at the GMSH to share those with me in Slack, because I cannot see them.
I'm just really happy I get to meet you this weekend, Dane.
Yes,
person.
Likewise. In real life. Looking forward to it. Andrew will be visiting us here in Toronto this weekend. So while we wait for some more questions to come in, I have a couple for you. So MPact was formerly known as the Global Forum on MSM and HIV.
Yes.
And, name change came and firmly sort of named, gay men in your work. And so I just wondered if you could share a little bit of what sort of propelled that change. And I come to that question with a lot of concern, maybe an ounce of frustration about sort of dominant language of MSM, men who have sex with men, which fulfills a particular public health interest, but it is not my belief that it necessarily serves gay men particularly well. And so I wanted to get a sense from you, your reflections on that.
So I'll tell you why it happened, and then I'll move into my own kind of feelings about it. So the Global Forum on MSM and HIV is a terrible name. It doesn't it doesn't say anything, right? And I think it came out of a very specific time when it was trying to engage the HIV response and force and really be clear what this was about. This was about men who have sex with men. This is about HIV. And it's done amazing work. This organization has done amazing work and has brought people together from all over the world, and has been a space that really incubates activists and organizations. And so, so even with a terrible name, we've done great things. And there was a move to rebrand because people really didn't know what that meant, and it was a mouthful, and it wasn't very good, like easy to talk about with people. So MPact was formed out of focus groups and discussions and brainstorms, and MPact really refers to the pact that we make with our communities around bringing people together and really being able to invest in our communities. The Global Action for Gay Health and Rights was, MPact's Global Action for Gay Health and Rights was put there as one title, one name for the organization, because we really wanted to emphasize that we're about rights too, as well as broader health issues than just HIV. I mean, HIV is a huge one in our community, but it's not the only one. There's mental health, there's substance use, there's not substance use. Substance use isn't, I'm not going to pathologize substance use. There's mental health. There's, the fact that, we're more likely to have, body dysmorphia and stuff like that than the rest of the community. So, and I think human rights are really important that we put those front and center, especially for gay people. I think the myths that I talk about around our community are real and circulate, and people honestly believe that we don't need anything. For my own life, I once gave a presentation at our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is our federal body health department, and our version of Public Health Agency of Canada, right? And the CDC, I was doing grand rounds, and I was doing a presentation of a research project I ran for Latino, gay, and bisexual men. And in the presentation, I kept on saying, Latino, gay, and bisexual men, Latino, gay, and bisexual queer people, blah, 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 blah. At the end, one of the CDC people raised her hands and she said, "Aren't you being very exclusionary by saying gay and bisexual and queer? Aren't these men who have sex with men?" And I just looked at her, and she was very proud of herself, very proud that she had confronted me. And I just looked at her and I said in the mic, I don't know. I know more people who identify as a cocksucker than I do men who have sex with a man. And the guy doing the audiovisual burst out laughing. He just burst out from the back of the room, and everyone was just shocked. And afterwards he said, that was broadcast to all of CDC globally. He said, "I think that's the first time somebody's a cocksucker on our channel." And I was like, "You should invite me more often." But I think that the men who have sex with men, nomenclature and that kind of categorization of us really denies our humanity and our community in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, and that's so much of what is lost actually with that centering and that use of language.
Yeah, I always think about, it's interesting to me because I get this pushback all the time around, like, a lot of the work that I want to push is really around effeminate men and queeniness and people that are gender nonconforming. And I get this pushback in our community that's like, well, what about the regular gay men? And I'm just like so pissed off at that because I'm just like, those queens are the ones that get targeted every day. Like, they're the ones that we really need to focus on. And so this whole, even the category man who has sex with a man, I'm like, I don't want any kind of terminology that's going to make the queenie people in our community, the gender nonconforming people in our community feel less involved, feel less included. It's just, we need to hold the space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, given what you outlined in terms of the global response to HIV, I mean, it would appear to me that HIV response perhaps needs to be a little bit more gay, actually, not less, and more queer, and more inclusive. Absolutely. And I'm just looking here. This is a great one. Very timely as we continue to navigate this. From your perspective, Andrew, what would the ideal global COVID and HIV recovery look like in our communities?
What would it look like? It would look like governments and multilateral organizations. So the multilaterals are the global groups like WHO, Global Forum, UN. So it would be governments and the multilaterals reinvesting in our communities for the long term and helping us create queer spaces that are safe and match what the queer communities locally want and need. Oftentimes governments will be like, oh, but we gave you money for a baseball park or something weird like that. And you're like, but we didn't ask for a baseball park. We wanted like
Except maybe the gay baseball league. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, but we painted rainbows on the sidewalk for you. Thanks, but we wanted a gay center. And so I think that that's part of it too, is making sure that the investment happens in a way that the communities want and need. I think that there needs to be business breaks. They need to do some innovation, some investment in queer businesses and queer entrepreneurship, not just queer, and we need investment in our queer community organizations, for the long term, not like this kind of like, here's 6 months of funding, or here's 12 months of funding, but you can't actually do anything that the community needs. Like one of the groups that I've met with here in Montreal is Rezo, and they do an amazing job working with sex workers in our community. And, I love to watch an organization that's like, this is what our community needs, so this is what we're going to provide them. And these are people that are part of our community, so this is what we're doing. And I know that it's a struggle to get funders to understand that. I deal with that every day, is trying to get funders to understand what our community needs really are. Oh, and one thing that governments could do very easily, by the way, is deal with migration in a humane way. Queer migration is real. And right now, the government systems are so messed up around migration that it's like, it's shocking. I work with a group in Argentina that was saying that like Argentina's allowed for 7,000 Syrians to come in, and they've only allowed actually 400. So the public message is, we're letting 7,000 Syrians in. And the actual
practice, of course, yeah.
It's 400.
Yeah, no, and I mean, we see, certainly migration patterns having an impact on HIV here in Ontario. Toronto has a rapidly growing, beautiful community of Latinx and Latino folks.
But one of the challenges with that is that if migrants, even if they're able to get access to a country like Canada, which has nationalized medicine, right, healthcare, they may not be able to access the healthcare because of their papers status.
Their status,
and that's
absolutely.
There has to be a solution.
Something maybe a little less serious. You've been in Montreal now for a couple of months. What's your favorite thing about the city so far?
Strippers.
Strippers.
Hey, I'm a firm believer that our community, there are strippers all over the world that need $1, and I'm happy to do my community service.
And there's so many options in the village.
There's so many options here. I enjoy that. I think the food's amazing. I love living in a city that is bilingual. I love the fact that I can go for a day without hearing English. And it makes me practice my French.
Nice.
Which is not easy because I'll try to speak French and Spanish will come out. I'm like, so close. But yeah, I love it here. It's a great city.
And you had mentioned, at the start of COVID, you moved to Guadalajara, and what a sort of rich experience that was. What made it so different from your time? And were you in Oakland before?
San Diego.
San Diego. Okay.
Yeah. So what made it different was being able to live all day in a non-English speaking space. To really struggle with communicating with people. My Spanish isn't great. And so I really had to kind of amp up that and to be able to connect to people. I ended up in a queer arts collective. And so like we just made art all the time, which was kind of fun. And also like I really realized that there was one of the things that I had to do to really learn, maybe it's an aging thing, maybe it was COVID, but I had felt very disconnected from my body. And in Guadalajara, I was really able to kind of like engage sex workers in a way that made sense for me to reconnect with my body and with my own sexuality. I'd mentioned that I was divorced. Divorce takes that, divorce is brutal, and I really had not reconnected with my sexuality since the divorce. So being in Guadalajara kind of helped me be able to kind of understand those changes in my body and in the ways that I understood it and the ways that I engaged other people.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, Andrew, as we prepare to head into our closing, I want to offer my thanks on behalf of the GMSH, but also, on behalf of everyone participating today. You and the MPact team are certainly doing our communities proud. I have been a keen follower of your work for several years now, before I had even found my way into being employed in the HIV response. And so it's really inspiring, this shift to be more central to community needs, to be a bit less safe for work, and to be, more joyful and more, sex positive, is a really wonderful thing. And so we thank you for joining us today and for your decades of service in the HIV response all around the world. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the audience for sticking through it with me. I know it's a long time to sit and watch somebody. And thank you, Dane, and I will see you this weekend.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew. All right. Hard to believe, but we are at the closing for GMSH 2021. In my opening remarks, I had shared that the GMSH was playing a really critical role in knowledge mobilization through the production of sexual health resources and digital content. And if this conference told us anything, it's that the need for, accurate, evidence-based, and sex-affirming messaging for gay and bisexual men about the realities of HIV today are as important as ever. We also heard about the distinct policy barriers. For example, those that are making it harder for gay men in Ontario to access PrEP, about the opportunities to meaningfully engage and embed trans and non-binary people in our response, and about systemic change required to ensure that no one is left behind. And this is especially true for our Black, Latino, and Two-Spirit communities. We heard encouraging news that Ontario is meeting and exceeding targets for gay men in the HIV cascade, which we see reflected in the changing epidemiology of HIV. We also know that these gains are not being experienced evenly in our communities. HIV among gay men in Ontario is increasingly Black and Latino, and that's a call to action for our alliance and for our sector. So make no mistake, we have work to do, and that starts with renewed calls to scale up HIV and STI testing, to advance evidence-based policy and practice, to ensure that shifts in HIV prevention and care are part of gay men's lived realities, and that each of us has what we need to thrive in our communities. But I'm really confident in our work. I'm really confident that by remaining true to shared values in our sector and across our alliance, and with the mobilization of gay men across the province, that we can do just that. In closing the conference, we need to ask you to do a couple of things. We are a bossy bunch. So first, keep your eye on your inbox. We're sending an evaluation and greatly appreciate your feedback on this, our first virtual conference. It's reviewed with intention and in the interest of strengthening our work. Keep your eyes on your mailbox for a token of our appreciation for joining us. And finally, if you missed one of the more than 25 sessions at this year's conference, the vast majority of them are going to be uploaded to YouTube on the GMSH page before finding their way to our new home, gmsh.ca, which is currently in development. So we hope you'll go back and check out what you missed, but also share these resources with your local stakeholders. I'm going to turn things over to my teammate, Adam Awad, who's our manager of communications, for some closing remarks in French, and I'll be back in a moment.
Thanks, Jane. Donc, pendant le mot d'ouverture, on a parlé de la façon dont le SSHG joue un rôle critique dans la transmission de connaissances en créant du contenu numérique et des ressources sur la promotion de la santé sexuelle. Les conférenciers nous ont présenté beaucoup de renseignements, par exemple le besoin de plus en plus urgent d'informations précises, factuelles et sex-positives pour les hommes gays sur les réalités du VIH aujourd'hui, les obstacles en matière de politique qui limitent l'accès à la PrEP pour les hommes gays, les possibilités d'intégrer les personnes non-binaires et trans dans notre travail et le besoin de changement systémique pour qu'on ne laisse personne de côté. On a aussi entendu des nouvelles encourageantes. L'Ontario atteint et surpasse certains objectifs dans la cascade du soin du VIH pour les hommes gays, une tendance que nous voyons dans les changements épidémiologiques du VIH dans la province. Par contre, on sait que cette tendance n'est pas une réalité pour toutes les communautés. Les cas de VIH augmentent parmi les hommes gays noirs et latinos, ce qui devrait nous pousser à l'action dans notre secteur. Soyons clairs, on a du travail à faire, bien sûr. Ça commence en redoublant nos efforts pour hausser le dépistage du VIH et faire progresser les politiques et les pratiques factuelles pour assurer que la prévention, le traitement et les soins liés au VIH font partie du vécu des hommes gays. Je suis certain qu'en restant fidèles à nos valeurs, en particulier nos valeurs protégées, et en mobilisant nos communautés, qu'on y arrivera. Pour terminer, on a quelques petites choses à vous demander. Premièrement, on va vous envoyer un courriel avec un lien vers un formulaire d'évaluation. On apprécierait beaucoup vos commentaires et, sur la première conférence virtuelle. On va regarder tous vos commentaires et en tenir compte pour les prochains ateliers et la prochaine conférence. Deuxièmement, on va vous envoyer par la poste un petit cadeau pour tout le monde. Et finalement, toutes les séances enregistrées seront disponibles sur YouTube dans la prochaine semaine et seront éventuellement sur le nouveau site de la SSHG qu'on développe présentement. J'espère que vous allez retourner voir ce que vous avez manqué et diffuser les séances avec vos intervenants locaux. Merci à tout le monde qui a assisté à la conférence. On apprécie grandement votre intérêt, votre participation, votre attention, et on est heureux de pouvoir organiser une conférence virtuelle. Oui, mais enfin, on a hâte de vous accueillir en personne la prochaine fois. Merci beaucoup. Back over to you, Dane.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. I have a few folks to thank, starting with the AIDS Bureau at the Ministry of Health for their ongoing support, the GMSH team for their hard work over many weeks and months, Devin Nambiar, Eric Peters, Adam Awad, Christopher Millay, and Jordan Bongor. Each of the knowledgeable and really passionate presenters, moderators, and co-hosts, thank you for really bringing it this year. We appreciate it. The fabulous team at King Events, if you are planning a virtual event, I highly recommend you get in touch with them. They created this beautiful virtual venue and ensured the smooth delivery of each of our sessions. And finally, thanks to each of you at home or at work, wherever you joined us from. We appreciate your interest, your engagement, and your time, especially during these COVID times. It is my sincere hope that we can come together in person next time. So my name's Dane Griffiths, Director of the GMSH. Remember that Black Lives Matter, every child matters, undetectable equals untransmittable, and PrEP works. This has been GMSH 2021. Until next time, take care. Thanks so much.